When we talk about memoir, there are so many ways we could go, so many things to discuss. Today, my guest is Robin Shepper, and she is the author of Finding My Way. Robin has an incredible story. This is a memoir that has multiple themes running through it. The themes that Robin tackles are political aspirations, the search for political transparency, identity, and family. And it's really incredible. It's a great story. It's her search for her biological father, among other things. So today we are chatting with Robin about her memoir, writing a memoir that's so deeply personal, and how do you do that? And then also, how do you get a memoir published when you are not a famous person? That's a really good question. Today we are talking memoirs with my guest, Robin Shepper. Welcome, Robin. I'm so glad that you are here.
I'm so glad to be here with you, Melissa.
Thank you. I love having such interesting guests on the Writer's Spark podcast, and you have such a wonderful breadth of experience. I like to start with kind of getting the origin story of the authors that I chat with. So I would just love to get a little bit of your background. Let's start with that.
My background, yeah, sure. So I am not a professional writer. My background is in communications, mainly political communications. So I've worked on 4 presidential campaigns, worked in the U.S. Senate, worked in the White House twice. Once for Bill Clinton, and then later worked for First Lady Michelle Obama. So my background is mainly politics. And I have a small consulting firm. I'm based in Colorado, and I work with nonprofits and governmental agencies working on their strategic plan. So I do a lot of writing, but a different type of writing.
Yeah, non-emotional writing, right?
Exactly.
Well, that's really interesting. So your background is, I mean, I've read the book and read things about you, but your background is that your mom was a stewardess, your grandmother owned a brothel,
Yes.
right? And you were searching for your biological father, and that's kind of how this memoir. Well, let's just talk about, how did this memoir come about? I know that you've written stories and have written for a long time, but when and how did you decide to put this into a memoir and say, this is what I'm going to write?
So you touched on this. So I've been writing short stories for a while, for many years, just as an intellectual exercise. And many people had said, you need to write a book. You have such great stories. So it was really during COVID. I was hiking
Mhm.
with a girlfriend, and she's writing an academic book, or she finished writing it as well. And so she challenged me, and she said, you keep talking about writing a book. When are you going to actually do it? So during COVID, I was not as social like so many people. So it took me about 2 years, but I started taking my short stories and trying to figure out a narrative arc. And the theme really that inspired me is in 2019. Through Consumer DNA, I found my biological father. I kept wanting to write a book, but I didn't have a good ending. And so finally finding out who he was then allowed me to figure out an ending and then put my short stories together as I mean, it's a story that starts with me as a 5-year-old and keeps going, but really the thread is the search for my biological father.
So when you talk about, work to create a narrative arc and to identify theme, but I would say there's multiple themes in this book. Did you, so you set out to find your biological father, and that was definitely a focus of the stories, but is that the only theme you identified, or did you identify other themes kind of going in and know that you wanted to thread them all together, which is what happens, and it's really wonderfully done, but there's a lot that you touch on.
Yeah. Well, I think I wanted to look at not just like how do would I find my dad, but how was it what were the issues that came up for me as a kid of not having a dad and growing up with a single mom and a grandmother who was really my other parent, until I was in my early 20s. So I I don't think I reached out for themes right away. I didn't say, "Oh, I want to talk about transparency." What helped me a lot is I'm a big fan of Post-its. So I wrote, I had written a ton of chapters. The book is really half of what I actually wrote. But I started writing chapter titles and kind of what was in the chapter, like what did I learned. So there's a chapter where I did my first protest in high school. So I wrote that down. And then just themes that I knew, that not themes, but incidents in my life. And I put it up on literally on the wall, a bunch of post-its. And I first did it chronologically. And then I started thinking about, oh, well, what are some themes that are coming out here through these stories? So I was taught, I had a great writing teacher that said,
Yes.
show me, don't tell
Every
me.
great writing teacher says that.
So so I would write it and then I would think, oh, okay, so what is this really about? Um, but the themes really came later because I really also subscribed to my writing teacher's adage as well. Just write, don't
Mhm.
think about it, just keep writing. So I just kept writing. And then when I had these post its, then it started becoming clear to me that issues of authenticity, transparency, honesty, me constantly uh, questioning the status quo,
Mhm.
for lack of a better word, are things that kept coming up. And so as I put these chapters together, I started seeing some consistency, which was hard to see at the very beginning when you just write a story, but it really started writing the stories, putting on the post-its, and then seeing, ooh, are there some things, some threads that piece this together?
Yeah, that's so interesting because I teach a memoir writing class actually, and one of the things that we do is talk about theme, but not so much as identifying it out of the gate, but seeing what evolves as you write your stories and then pulling more out to kind of expand upon that theme or those themes that you touch on. Rarely is there just one theme in anything. But yeah, that's, I mean, that and you touched on something else saying what did I learn. Those are the two most important things in my opinion in a memoir, because it's trying to kind of tap into the collective consciousness, right, of the people that are reading it, of our society, and then what did you learn and what can they learn in the process.
Hmm.
So
Yes, exactly right.
what were your some of your takeaways from writing this memoir?
Well, having been a woman, I just turned 60. So I was born in the 60s, grew up in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and really started in the workplace in the mid 80s. And so the lesson I learned really was that as women, yes, we've come a long way, but there's still so much more to go. And so part of the reason I wrote it as well is I was hoping to inspire other women to hear my story. That the big theme for me is always life is not a straight line, but
Mm-hmm.
we keep moving forward. And if we approach our careers and life with authenticity and honesty, then we can have more. I don't want to say valuable is not the right words, but have careers that we value, so that it doesn't feel like we're just working. So I think the thing that I realized was that I'm not the only one, and I'm standing on the shoulders of women before me that are now in their 70s or 80s. But I think the feedback that I've gotten from people about my book, the content is that um, more of us need to support each other, especially from the workplace, and all the things that happen to us as women. So, what I learned a lot was that my story may be unique, but the themes in my story are pretty common.
Right, and that's what helps us all tap into that and take our own lessons from reading somebody else's story. I think that's the beauty of the memoir. You know, it's so fascinating to get to experience somebody else's life and see what they've gone through and learn from that, but then apply it to our own lives because we all have these themes threading through our own lives. There are only so many things, you know, that we can tap into. That's that collective unconsciousness.
Totally.
I love that. You touched on something a second ago when you said your writing teacher said to just write. I call writing brain thinking, basically, because I'm a fiction writer also. And even in writing fiction, so much of my stories evolve and just come out through the writing process, things that I never could have planned. And writing nonfiction as well, or memoirs, I think that that's been my experience as well, that I don't necessarily remember something, but then I start writing and there's a trigger, and all of a sudden there's this avalanche of memories and content coming out. So can you speak to that, and how much of your process was sort of pre-planned and how much came about really organically through the writing process?
Yeah, I wouldn't say a lot was pre-planned. I had short stories that I had started really almost 20 years ago, and when I started putting the post-its on the wall, I realized, ooh, I have some holes. Like I
Mhm.
didn't, I didn't write about my first marriage that failed, or I didn't write about some other things. So, um, I think the process of just writing just made me a better writer. I tell my kids, I have one in college and one in high school, and when they're writing papers, I'm like, the first draft is never the final draft, and they're like, I don't want to do another draft. And so what I have found is that, um, yeah, it becomes organic, and there's a lot of things that either get triggered or there's a memory. And for me, a lot is music. I hear a song and I'll remember something from my past. And I carry a notebook like this. I have millions of, not millions, but many of these that I write notes, and then I type faster than I can actually write. So I have notes that I look at, and I would write the stuff, and again, the same writing teacher, she had me do this exercise. This was decades ago, of a quadrant, and in the quadrant was a color in each quadrant, like blue, yellow, orange, green, red, and then I had to do the senses for each quadrant, like what does blue smell like, what does it taste like, what does it sound like, what does it feel like, what does it hear like. And I for me, the process was, it really forced me. I looked at my senses, not just telling the story like I went down the street with my dog and saw blah, whatever, so that um, I kept coming back to the senses of what can I add so that my reader can really feel like they're in New York City, or in Seattle, or in Athens, Greece, or, all the different places in my book. And I think the process was, I would write, but then I would go back and then I would change the verbs. Like I would take out the thesaurus and try to get more verbs. And then I would go back and say, okay, I haven't said anything about how it smells like, or how it tastes like, or what the sounds were. So it was this kind of layering approach. And at least having, it's almost like having the outline for a term paper. If I had that outline and then I could start filling in with richer language and also the senses, I felt like the chapters were better. But each of my chapters, I probably edited at least 5 times, maybe 10 times. But it was just more just write and get it out there. And then
Wow.
if I started thinking about the other pieces, then it just became a richer chapter.
Yeah, so I was recently speaking with Zara Altair, who's a fiction writer, and she just dropped this little tidbit that Walter Mosley apparently revises 40 times one piece.
40 times.
I know.
Wow.
That's what I said. I just about dropped 40 times. And, I edit and revise however much a particular piece needs to be edited and revised. And it always does. And 4 to 5 is kind of, I'm right in there with you. But 40, I was like, wow. So you can kind of go overboard. Although, he is Walter Mosley. So, okay.
Yeah, yeah.
So you touched on another thing. You're kind of working my way through my questions. So sensory language, that is something that I tap into, and we have exercises in my memoir class as well, because that is showing versus telling. I mean, you've got to kind of tap into those senses in order to bring a scene alive in whatever way you want to. And you mentioned that you have these settings and Seattle and Athens and New York. And when I think of certain books, for example, Gone with the Wind, I think Atlanta is a character in that
Right.
city. Some books really paint a picture and bring a place alive, and I felt that way with New York. And so I'm wondering again, how much is intentional and how much just kind of evolved and made this into a character in your book.
That was actually very intentional. I had written a fair amount about New York City because I felt like it was another character for me. As an only child, I spent a lot of time walking the streets of New York and going to Central Park, and a lot of time by myself with my dog and the city. And the city to me is alive. It's not just concrete and trees. So that was very intentional, to make that character. And I guess I don't feel that way about the other cities that I talked about because I didn't spend as much time really talking about Seattle or talking about Washington D.C. or Athens, Greece, because for me New York just had such a huge impact on who I am and just was part of my life growing up.
So do you think that's what it boils down to, is your experience in a place and the impact that place has on you versus anybody can step into Seattle and New York, and are they going to have the same sort of visceral experience because the city is pulsing with activity and life and all of that?
I never really thought about it. You're the first person to ask me that. It's kind of now I'm kicking myself. I'm like, oh, I should have written more about Washington D.C. So I don't know if it's an either or. I think it's more of like, the author, how you feel. And again, because I was a latchkey kid and spent so much time alone, that New York was almost like another parent. I learned
Mm,
so much from the actual city and the other cities I lived in, but I don't feel I learned from the city. I learned from the
yeah,
experiences I had, my jobs or friends, but New
yeah.
York was almost like a teacher.
And I think that, in terms of creating place, a place has an identity and there are other cities that simply don't have identity. So I'd be very hard pressed to, turn Elk Grove, California, where we spent 10 years into a character in a book. That would be pretty tough. But, Seattle does have a culture. It does have an identity. New York does, Dallas does, certain places do. And that helps, I think, bring it alive, which I think is actually just really interesting. I haven't ever talked about this with anybody before, but the idea of a place having such a strong identity and where that comes from. Why does this city have so much identity and this one doesn't?
Yeah, yeah,
It's just
yeah. For me, it was just an all-encompassing place for me, and just had such an impact of who I am.
This episode is sponsored by the Writer Spark course, What's Your Story? Do you have a story to tell? The short answer is yes. The long answer is that everyone has a life story worthy of telling. Whatever your life experience is, you can turn them into a memoir. Have you experienced a life-changing event? Do you have a foundational friendship, an amazing job or career, or a family story? Are you a survivor? Do you have deep convictions? We all have stories to tell. Even the ordinary can become extraordinary when you put pen to paper. Writer Spark's What's Your Story memoir class is a self-paced course designed to help you dive into the process of writing your memoir. Learn more at writersparkacademy.com. Earlier, you touched on something else and you said that only half of what you wrote actually made it into this book. So I would love to hear about how you made those choices, what to put in this book, and if that was sort of theme related as you developed the themes, and also if you're going to write a second memoir with the other half of the book.
Um, Well, it was actually what I tell everybody that's wanting to write. I say find a good editor. So I found a good editor. I had three editors for this process, so I hired my own editor to help me with the narrative arc, and she saw things I didn't see as well
Mhm.
in the book, and I was like, oh, I hadn't thought about that. So she helped me narrow down some of the extraneous things that she thought just took away from the story. We're interesting stories. I have like lots of stories, but she said, okay, this kind of like takes you off track. Like you don't need. I mean, like great story, but why are you telling it? Like what is the reader learning? Um, what was hard for me is I wrote a lot of dialogue, which I thought was great.
Mhm.
But the second editor that was from my publisher just said the dialogue is great, but this book is too long, so
Oh.
we need to cut the dialogue. So it just became just more of the advice I got from the publisher of what is the length of a typical memoir.
Mm.
And then what I had was way too long. So that was really painful of cutting dialogue was really, really hard. And,
Mhm.
my, like so many authors, my dream is for this to become, a TV series or a movie. And I think, oh, I already have the dialogue. I can give you the dialogue because I wrote it
Yeah.
already. Um,
Right.
but it was so it was my editor, then the publisher's editor, and then because I have a political background, I talk. I had more actually elected officials in there, and the publisher had an editor that was specialized in libel.
Oh.
So there are some things that are taken out, mainly not that I'm bad mouthing anybody, but just things that were
Protection.
again protection. Do I really need to say that or not? That whatever it because I don't want anybody to sue me. So I
Yeah,
learned a
that would
lot.
not be
I learned
desirable.
a yeah, I learned a lot through that process of um, I guess, I don't know if this is a question to you, but the big thing I learned is that when you write a memoir, you don't have to write, you're not writing an autobiography. So,
Exactly.
so that was I would say that was the biggest lesson for me. And I kept saying, oh, that's a really interesting story, or that's an interesting story. But my editor really kept me on task to say, okay, does this support these themes of authenticity, honesty, transparency, and looking for your dad? And I'm like, no, it's just a funny story. So that
Yeah.
was hard.
That is hard. I think that's a difficult concept for writers, memoirists, aspiring memoirists to really embrace, that not everything needs to be told. It does not need to be told chronologically. It does not need to start. I mean, yours did start when you were young for reasons connected to your book, but not every memoir needs to start when you're young, and doesn't need to go all the way through every step of your life. You pull out those themes and you write multiple memoirs based on the different,
Right.
paths that you are taking with each different one. Each different one. That didn't sound very
Yeah. Yeah. No, no, I understand what you're saying.
good. Yeah. All right. So I, everybody has their traumas. And, one of the things I tell my students is that, you don't have to have trauma to write a memoir. You don't have to have trauma to write a story, right? Everybody has a story, and it's how you put it down on paper. That being said, we've gone through some things, and I've tried to write about them in the past, and it was so difficult because, as you said, it brings up emotions, music and scents, smells and different things. And I'm a highly emotional person, as any one of my children would tell you. uh, it was just so emotionally draining. I just really struggled with it. Now, 20 years later, I'm at a much better place, and I've, accepted things, and I can write about some of those things with a little bit more distance. But my question to you is, how do you handle the emotions of your stories during the writing process? How do you not get sort of derailed by those emotions? Or do you? And did it take a long time to kind of work through this?
Yeah. Um, yeah, trauma is such an interesting thing. Someone asked me that question is, when you're asking memoirist, people that write memoirs to
Yeah.
write about trauma, are you asking those writers to relive their trauma? And I think for everybody, it's different.
Mhm.
It was definitely hard to write, and there were times uh, where I would just have to put stuff down and then I couldn't write for a couple of days. I would definitely cry when I would write. But the thing that inspired me, the North Star, for lack of a better word, is I wanted to share my trauma because I know other women have been sexually assaulted. And I said, I don't want to be ashamed. I don't want to feel like a victim. I want to own it, to describe it, and then just kind of show that for me, that trauma propelled me to want to work in a field where I could make a difference. So I kept thinking about how can I write it in a way that could help other people. So it's not just my catharsis, which there was some, but mainly, can I write it in a way that is impactful for other people, that you're not going through every graphic detail, but
Mhm.
understanding the emotional side of it, and that could it help other women talk about their trauma and then just move forward. But I think every writer's got to decide how they want to do it. I wrote it the way I did, and again, not in graphic detail, but enough detail to so that the reader knows what's going on. And I've already gotten amazing feedback from women that I had never known who had been raped and sexually assaulted, that I'd known for 20 years, 30 years. And after they read my book, they shared with me their stories. And I think sometimes it's safer to tell your story when you know somebody else has gone through that themselves, because often when it happens, at least when it happened to me, like so many people, I didn't even know what it was. It
Mhm.
wasn't until years later till a therapist explained to me what had happened. And I was like, oh.
Mhm.
So I think just being empathetic to others, but just I think sometimes, like everything, when we feel a kinship or some people would understand what they've gone through, that they may be able to share it. So that's the lens that I kept looking through, is like, can I use my hardship as a way to help somebody else that's gone through this?
Yeah, I love the idea of you being a voice to help bring other people out or help them understand what they went through. If you didn't understand what you had gone through and a therapist helped you, but what about these five women who didn't go to a therapist and who've been living with this? And so what you have written can help, create a bridge for them to deepen their understanding of what they went through and what they need to do from this moment on. That's
Yeah,
powerful.
yeah, that's my hope. That's my hope.
Yeah. And I love the concept of the North Star. This is that, when you're writing fiction too, it's very easy to get off track and write something that you just love. This is a scene that's so perfect, but it has nothing to do with your story. And that's when you have to cut. But having the idea that there's this North Star always guiding you, there's this hero's journey, there's this, whatever it is that can keep you focused, I think is a great visual, just a great analogy for the writing process and how you stay kind of true to what you're trying to create here.
Yeah, thank you.
So you talk about discovering your biological father through the DNA. So what was that like? Because, I hear stories. I sat next to this lady on the airplane one time who was coming back from Texas. I'm in North Carolina. So she was coming from Texas to North Carolina, as was I. And she was visiting her biological father for the first time. And she didn't know that the father who raised her was not her biological father until he had already passed. And then her mother was like, "Oh, well, who's that?" It was a one night stand kind of a thing. Like, blows up your life, right? So, you hear all of these stories, but you set out with a different intention. But what was that, process like for you?
Well, it was a lifelong process, which is, if your listeners read the book, which I hope they do, it's something from the very, unlike a lot of people, like the story that you told, the consumer DNA is shedding a lot of secrets of people that their dads that they thought were their dads are not their dads. So I never had a dad. So that was always a hole. So that was always a question. And just a brief description in the book is that my mother, who was a stewardess in the '60s, and there were a lot of married businessmen that were on the planes at the time. So she had an affair with a married man that she was totally in love with, and she put his name on my birth certificate, but he was not my biological father. But I thought he was until I was
Mhm.
like almost 20 years old. And so
Yeah.
I won't go into all the details. So then there was another prospect. So then for years I thought he was my biological father, but he never acknowledged me. I never met him. I talked to his wife, who said, you probably a nice young lady, but he's not your father. Stop talking to us. So I think it brings up a lot of stuff for lots of people. I just wanted to. I got sick in my 20s. I got seizures, and I thought if I found my biological father, and then the third one is, because my kids are adopted, the whole family, we did 23andMe and Ancestry. Just thought, we could find some stuff out about our kids and us as well. And um, I had my mother do it. And then when in 23andMe, you can see the biological profile of your mother and the biological profile of your father. And what's so interesting for so many of these people is that then I saw the different nationalities, and she had always told me he was this German from Bavaria. And then the DNA profile had like Norwegian and German and Irish and like all the stuff. And I was like, no, this isn't American. So I think the process was long for me. It really closed a loop for me. Like, oh, and when I never got to meet him, but when I read his obituary, I realized he was so much like me, and it just because I'm not like my mother at all. So I was just like, oh, it's not just passing on hair color and eye color; it's so much more. So the process um, was wonderful in the side that I finally figured it out. But sad on the other hand that he had just died 1 year before I found him. So I never got to meet him, but now I have cousins that I never had, and they're actually coming to one of my book parties. So I've been in touch with them. So I think the process is hard, and what do you? Again, I always the question, what do you learn from there? So I guess family is what you create, and as even though I have new cousins, I don't have history. So I have way more history with close girlfriends that I've had for 30 years than family. So family, I think, is kind of what you create and what you want to get out of it. But I think as Americans, we're always curious, and so it's answered a lot of questions for me. Um, but it's hard to fill the hole that was there for so many decades.
Oh my gosh, yeah, and it forces you in your situation to reframe what you thought you knew, and to be open to understanding that what you thought you knew about yourself and your background is actually not the case at all. And then how do you kind of make that shift? I mean, that's a lot to sort of deal
Yeah,
with.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, and actually, I've kind of used it as a lesson tool for my kids. So, because one son knows his biological mother, but my other son doesn't know his biological parents. So, I've kind of said, well, who knows? Maybe when you're my age, you'll find them as well. But
Yeah,
I just always say to them, what's most important is the family that we've created. So,
exactly. I say that too. Is we've had a couple of people over the years, friends of my kids, come into our lives and stay in our lives, and we've become family, and they've become family. And so I always say, you're born with the family you're born with, but then the family you choose also. These are the people that you choose to surround yourself with, and you choose them as your family. And two beautiful, equally important sides of that coin.
right, exactly.
Okay, so do you have any tips for aspiring memoirists or people that, just have this inkling of an idea that they'd love to tell some part of their story?
Well, for me, the things that helped a lot was having a group of people that were my guinea pigs that
Mhm.
that I would send, not the whole story because I didn't really have it at the beginning, but just little tidbits, and they'd say, "Oh yeah, this is good. I want to know about more about X." So I think having your own kind of beta testing group for your stories, and then trying to think about. We often don't think about, like, once the story is written, what do you want your readers to come away with? And so I think I thought about that a lot, and mainly because of my work. That's what I do in communications. So I think that's an important thing, and it's hard to start writing like that. But when you just write, and then you have some interesting stories and get some feedback from some close friends or family, whomever it is, and then you figure out, okay, so if this is a story I want to tell, what do I want the reader to do or feel or think after they've read it? And to me, that was, again, that was my North Star. It's like,
Mhm.
uh, what a lot of people have said to me, you were brutally honest. And I live in a small town. I had one at my local bookstore. They said, how you feel like now in a small town, everybody knows your secrets. And I'm like, hey, if it helps one person
Mhm.
with their trauma, I don't really care. But you
Yeah.
have to decide that for yourself, because not everybody wants to be that honest, or that's not the goal of the book. There may be
Mhm.
something else that they want to write. So to me, the big things were having a North Star of, what are you trying to accomplish, knowing what kind of audience you want to reach and what you want them to learn, and then just writing stories and having some people give you feedback.
Yeah, and not being heavy-handed with it, I think, is important. Also, your goal is not to tell a story and say what I learned here, what you can learn from this is,
Oh,
but it's
right.
all embedded into the writing process and is revealed as you are writing, and so is revealed as somebody is reading it. You're not teaching an explicit moral necessarily. So I think
Correct.
that's something to really be cognizant of, I think, as you're writing. And whenever you find yourself saying, this is what I learned, no, 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 XXX, and figure out how to embed that in. But yeah,
Yes.
comes
Yeah.
with it.
Yeah.
That's why you need the editor too.
Well, yeah, and I have to say, I mean, again, the feedback that I've gotten, I have thoughts. I have two books in mind that I want to write next, and one of them is, I don't know enough about my grandmother, but I might write a novel about her based on her, the stories that I know. But I'm going to have to fill in some fiction, because
Mhm.
I don't know everything. Uh, it's interesting when you write, then the feedback that you get. So I've gotten a fair amount of feedback from people like, "Oh, I want to know more about your grandmother."
I do too.
Um,
I'm one of those.
and then the other one was really for me. Again, the theme is that, not what I learned, but it's happened numerous times from actually grammar school classmates I've heard, and some people that I've worked with, of, uh, don't judge people by their cover, right? Don't judge book by their cover. Like, there's so many nuances to people, and you have no idea what's going on underneath. And so I think that's the interesting part when you write a memoir, that you're sharing something that people would not expect from you.
Hmm. Yeah. Sometimes I think you're sharing things you don't even know about yourself until you've gone through this process, and then you are burying yourself. I mean, it's very personal, and people are quick to judge, and so you have to also be prepared for that sort of judgment, and that the
Definitely.
critics out there, who are going to say, "Oh, this was wonderful," or "This sucked," or "This didn't apply to me," or whatever, and they're not always kind, these people.
No, no.
Yeah, so you have to really prepare yourself if your intent is to publish, rather than
Definitely.
writing it. Like my parents wrote their memoirs, which is what motivated me to create this memoir writing class. But, it's for us, it's for their family. Their intent was never to publish it. So that's a little bit different. But even so, at a couple points we're like, Mom, are you sure you want to say that about your cousin? Kidding. Okay, so one last question I have. This has been so great talking to you. I've really enjoyed it. But my last question for you is, what was your process for getting your memoir published? If you are Michelle Obama or Will Smith or Matthew McConaughey or, any of these celebrity names, it's a piece of cake, right? Not so much a piece of cake for, any ordinary person. And you fall definitely somewhere in between, because you do have this career and this presence, so what was that process like? And then any thoughts on how an ordinary person might get their memoir published?
Interesting. Well, I was just at the American Library Association annual meeting this past weekend in Chicago,
Mhm.
and the amount of publishers that are out there, I was like, I couldn't believe it.
It's
Um, uh,
mind-boggling.
I was overwhelmed. I mean, I grew up in New York City, but just the sensory overload of,
Mhm.
there was the Penguin and Simon Schuster and all the ones that are very well known, but there were so many small presses. So
Mhm.
I would say a couple things. One, I got very lucky in that my first editor that I hired, she loved my book so much um, that she recommended me to my publisher.
Oh, nice.
So I really lucked out. Other people, I mean, there are services out there that you can pay somebody to find a publisher for you, and that
Mhm.
you got to spend money. And then the other thing is finding niches, because there's different types of publishers. There's I don't know how much your listeners know, but there's your traditional publishing, um, and those usually take the big names, but they also take a
Mhm.
bigger cut. They take a bigger percentage of your
Mhm.
writing, and then there's the hybrid publishing, where you partner with a publisher, but you get more of a percentage back. And then there's the self publishing.
Mhm.
So the track I was going down, for myself, actually, I was finding publishers that specialized in women's stories, um, doing women authors. So they're out there,
Mhm.
but I lucked out. But I would say for any writer, they need to, um, as difficult it was to write the story, the hardest part has been really is the working with the publisher, editing to be, perfect of the book, but even more so is the marketing,
Mhm.
because you have to self market. So publishers really don't, unless you're, Prince Harry, um, or you're hiring a publicist for 5 grand a month. Um,
Mhm.
it is very, it is very time consuming, and that is the part that I do not like at all, of constantly selling myself and my book and
Mhm.
talking like, oh yes, read my book, or posting on social media. But publishers look at that, like, how big is your social media following? How well known are you? Do you have a affinity groups? So I would say the finding a publisher is one part of it, but the other part is just making sure you either have the time or the budget to do the marketing, because it's so rare that the publishers are going to do it for you.
And the desire and the energy, because it's nonstop. You just have to keep your book will sell, hopefully, as long as you keep marketing it, but the
Yep.
moment you stop, that's it. It goes away.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a commitment. Yeah, but you're
Yeah,
so
it's
right about having a built-in audience. Publishers look at that, and agents. Do you have an agent?
no, I do not.
You went straight to the publisher. Well, so yeah, the agents and editors at the publishing houses, I mean, they're going to look at those followings, especially for nonfiction books and memoirs, because they want to know that there are people out there already primed and ready to buy. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's.
exactly. Exactly.
Mhm.
Yeah. So, so I was lucky, like the Obama alumni newsletter, put my book in the newsletter, I'm working to do the
That's
same
helpful.
thing. Yeah, that's, so that goes just to the staffers, but that's hundreds of people. So,
Hmm.
yeah, you're just using anything, but when they were interviewing me, like they didn't just become my publisher because my editor said, I had to do this whole questionnaire that
Hmm.
talked about who was my target audience and who could I reach through my networks.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, and I don't know the agent route. So, I didn't find an agent. I might still try to find one, but I just went the route that the path that was open to me. So I just started there.
Yeah. If you write the sort of narrative nonfiction or fiction nonfiction hybrid that you're talking about, I think an agent probably is the way to go unless you plan to indie publish it. But
Yeah.
fiction is sort of a different beast.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Robin, thank you so much for being here. This has been fascinating, and I loved speaking with you. I loved hearing your stories. I loved reading your book, and I hope that everybody does go read it. Um, Tell us where they can find it and where they can find you.
Uh, Yeah, sure. So I have a website that's Robin F. Shepper, so SCHEPPER author.com. And I have a list of all the different places you can get it. So Barnes and Noble, Amazon, it's on Kindle. There's also an audiobook. So on all the Spotify, Apple,
Mhm. Mhm.
Audible. It's on all the platforms, obviously on Amazon, like everybody else, and in your local bookstore. So I hope your listeners read my book. It's called Finding My Way, a memoir about family identity and political ambition.
Yeah, I hope everyone goes out and reads it too. Order it from your indie bookstores. All of that will also be in the show notes for everybody listening, so you'll be able to find that as well.
Yeah.
All right, Robin, thank you so much for being here again. I appreciate your time and the opportunity to chat with you about memoirs.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for listening and spending your time with me today, everyone. I'm Melissa Bourbon, and this is the Writer's Spark podcast. Take a moment to visit our website at www.writersparkacademy.com. Check out our courses, our resources, and all the content there. And I will see you next time. Until then, happy writing.